Welcome back, gang. It's Delty from DeltyIsGaming.com with a special guest, Woeler, part of EUPC Stud Muffin Tank, right?
Yep, my name is Woeler. I'm from EUPC. Been playing tank since the game's been released. Raiding with some prominent raid guilds like Omnia Vincent. And yes, today Delty invited me to have a little talk about tanking.
So I think we get a lot of comments, a lot of questions about tanking, ranging from leveling up or what's the best gear, and bringing in a pro here that focuses just on that to give you guys some more insight. So what we're going to do is a couple different videos breaking down misconceptions of tanking, useful buffs and skills, gear sets, what's tanky and what is useful for your group, and then like some basic builds and loadouts so you guys can have a better understanding of tanking in general and get excited about playing it, because I don't think there's enough people playing the role or really excited about it and really embrace what the tank can do for your group. So that being said, what are some misconceptions of tanking war?
The first misconception that comes along very often and that gets asked a lot of times is, what's my rotation? How do I use skills effectively in the game to be a good tank? And the first thing that has to be said about that is that as a tank, you do not have a rotation. This doesn't exist. This is something for DPS players. When you are playing a tank, you are playing a role that is reaction, not action, but reaction, meaning you act to what is happening on the battlefield. Your situational awareness is very important. And as soon as certain things start to happen, start to get out of hand, you are responsible for taking the required action. See somebody going behind the boss, and you know he's going to do a cleave attack. Okay, that means dodge roll, other side, make sure boss doesn't do anything to this guy. This is the way you play a tank. It has nothing to do with mesmerizing rotations, keeping up skills that like a DPS does with bar swapping and everything. It's pure reactionary play, of course, apart from your general buffs that you have. But yeah, that's one of the biggest misconceptions, that people think the tank has to play with the rotation, and that is just something that doesn't happen when you are playing endgame tank.
Speaking of that, it's not like your job isn't just to sit there and block and mindlessly let things happen.
Problem with this is that a lot of other games that have tanks in their role, the Holy Trinity, tank, healer, DPS, the tank is the guy that stands and blocks and gets all the damage and doesn't do much else. The thing in Elder Scrolls Online is that taking damage and mitigating damage is quite easy. It doesn't require a lot of skill. Everybody can do it. And the thing with that is you do not need to be full tanky to be successful in that part of the job. There are sets out there that will give you a ton of armor and a ton of resistances, but at the end of the day, you will survive these blows or these hits from bosses or mobs without sets like this, which means that to effectively play, you can take out parts of being actually tanky and putting them into supporting the group, which means you will still stay alive, but instead of being super tanky, you will be somebody that buffs group mates or debuffs bosses. To be a good tank, you have to find this perfect balance between the minimum amount of tankiness that you can sustain and the maximum amount of support that you can get for your group.
Keep in mind, what you're trying to do to min-max your tank role is survive the bosses, priority number one, but don't go ultra, because if you survive, everyone else is dead, you're not killing the boss. What can you do in your role to buff the group?
And then there's the other thing that you see, and it's the other side of the spectrum, and that is tanks that want to do damage. And the problem that lies with this is, if you want to be want to survive certain encounters, you will just have to reach a minimum amount of survivability required. And most of the times when you're doing this, you will not be able to provide decent DPS. In a dungeon, these things might work out. Let's say they might work out, as some dungeons are really not that hard. But in trials, it's absolutely as a tank, if you're doing damage, if you're playing your DK, you're putting burning embers on the boss, this makes no sense, right? Your spell damage is low, your max damage gets low, it won't scale, it will do basically nothing. But what often what people forget is that if there is damage on the boss, you can contribute to this damage. It doesn't have to come from you, but it can go through you. If you buff people with powerful assault, which gives spell and weapon damage, you can essentially have 9 or 10 DPS players do more damage because of you. So indirectly, you are doing more damage. You are providing the group with more damage. This is also true for the Warhorn ultimate. You are casting it, other people are doing more damage. And this is far more effective than the damage you can output alone while wearing your half DD, half tank setup, while you could be providing your group with support, which will increase the overall DPS way more. Of course, it won't show up on your DPS meter, but in the end, you will be faster and more effective than if you would just be this half build, half tank, half DPS build.
Warhorn's a great example. So let's go a little bit more specifically into some of these useful buffs and debuffs. So you have a website, Woeler.eu.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
So on this website, you will find information about tanking, builds, but mostly the general parts of information that you would like to know. There's a lineup of sets that I rank from useful to very useful to mastery of when you're playing a tank, what situations they apply, um, when to use such sets, or what level of mastery of the role they require. For instance, there are sets like Akaviri Dragon Guard, which is a set that reduces ultimate cost. Now it's a heavy set, so you won't lose a lot of tankiness while you will be gaining faster Warhorns, which is a good compromise for a beginning tank. But of course, there's also an explanation about sets like Powerful Assault, which is a complete medium set, which requires you to run a complete medium setup, but which gives the group members that you have more spell damage and more weapon damage. So it will go up all the way from level beginner to all the way up to level master, and you will be able to see what sets should suit you best and how you can progress through this line of setups to ultimately reach the goal of becoming one of the best tanks in the game. Skills as a tank, we have only a few skills that are really crucial, and the rest is kind of how to say, you can swap them out. At first, we have the Pierce Armor, which is the first skill of One Hand and Shield. Now, this skill has two morphs, and a very common misconception about this skill is that the Pierce Armor would make some conflicts with other skills that your healer was using. Now, let's put that out of the way, that is not true. But why this skill is so important is, first of all, it's a taunt. So it will make the enemy, it will force them to hit you for 15 seconds. And it will apply a major spell damage, major spell resistance, and major armor debuff on your target. So you will be reducing their resistances just by taunting them. And this is very important because this debuff runs every 12 seconds, the taunt runs 15 seconds. That means if you retaunt every 12 seconds, you will make sure that 100% of the time this debuff will be on the boss, and nobody else is forced to run any other skills that do the same debuffs. So Pierce Armor is really one of the skills you should be using. There's absolutely no reason not to run it. Then, of course, we have the second skill, which is the Heroic Slash. I'm not really sure what the unmorphed version is called, but this skill is important because of two reasons. The first reason is it gives the boss or the mob minor maim, and minor maim reduces the damage they do by 15%, which means you're essentially providing some sort of indirect protection to your group members by making the boss do less damage. Now this runs for 12 seconds. The second thing is you also gain minor heroism, which gives you one extra ultimate every 1.5 seconds while you are gaining ultimate. Now, why is this important? Because you will be using ultimates that support your group, and the faster you can gain, the more support you can give. This particular debuff or buff on you runs 9 seconds, so you need to recast Heroic Slash ideally every 9 seconds in combat. You're keeping the boss debuffed, he's doing less damage, and you will be gaining more ultimate. It's a win-win skill. Then we have the third skill from One-Handed Shield, which is Absorb Magic. Now, this skill is useful for certain encounters because you can absorb magical projectiles and heal yourself with it, but that's not the main reason we use it. The main reason we use it is because it reduces your cost of blocking by 8%, and it increases the amount of damage your block will mitigate, so the amount of damage that will not hit you when your block is up by 8%, just by having it slotted, which means that a skill like this is very handy to have on your first bar, as it gives you free block cost reduction, free damage mitigation. You don't even have to activate it, it just has to sit there. The Alliance War tree, and it is Vigor, or more importantly, the Echoing Vigor. Now this skill is an AoE heal, and we choose the Echoing Vigor and not the Resolving Vigor, which seems to be the predominant morph, because it's not about healing ourselves, it's about healing other people. And this morph has a wider range. The other morph heals you for more, but technically that should not be needed. So you're using Echoing Vigor to get heals distributed over your group. And it's a pretty powerful heal over time. Stalwart Guard from the other Alliance War tree. Now this is an interesting skill, because it will create a beam between you and a certain person. And by having this beam active, it means that 30% of the damage they take will be redirected to you. Now the interesting thing about this is the damage they take will first go through their block and through their armor. Then it will be transferred by guard to you, going through your block, going through your armor. So basically at the end of the line there's not going to be a lot of damage left. But you've taken 30% of that guy's damage away. And by having this active, the player will get minor force all the time. So they will do 10% more damage by crits.
Okay, so those are some core skills based to the one-handed shield, which everyone gets access to, right? So some outside skills, we already talked about Warhorn. Most people know about this. Aggressive increases your group's damage tremendously. Major Force and increases your max stats. Major Force only lasts 9.5 seconds, but the whole buff lasts 30. So really coordinated groups are trying to get that 9.5 seconds. In general, newer groups are trying to get that 30-second mark. So just keep in mind, that's what it's used for. Every class has a way to get a certain buff that is very useful, and that is your major resistances, major resolve, major ward. So for the Dragonknight, we use hardened armor, so it reflects some damage, it gives us max health, and it's just a great ability, and it's 20-second duration. So for a Nightblade, you can use a shadow skill. A Sork, you have your own armor version, and for a Templar, you have focus. So everyone can get that. You can also get the same buff from the armor, heavy armor skill line as well, though it takes a ton of stamina. So either way, generally, a tank is going to want to have that as at least one of the buffs they take. Some things like Green Dragon's Blood also amplify the healing you receive, along with Igneous Shields. And same thing with Templar, you can use Restoring Focus. Sork doesn't have those applications, but you can use other skills to get around it. You can even make a shield build if you want. All sorts of different ways to play a tank, but what's core to it is ultimately taunting, debuffing, and buffing yourself to get the armor up. Also useful ultimates. Every class has their own way of an oh crap button. So Magma Shell on Dragonknights. Sorks have Negate, which can heal themselves and are really useful heal allies, along with Echoing Vigor. Sorks make actually really good tanks. Nightblades, Veil of Blades, major protection. Templars, Nova, another source of major damage reduction. So ultimately, you can buff your group, and have an oh crap moment is usually a pretty good idea for just a standard tank build. Another thing I like about the Dragonknight is the skill Deep Breath. I don't think a lot of people use it, But the thing that it does is it allows an AoE interrupt. It does damage, does heal you, and that's great, but sometimes it's hard to bash a lot of targets, especially if they're behind you and someone else can't get to them. In some mechanics, you're just going to die if you don't interrupt, and you might be out of stamina. This is a really useful skill for the Dragonknight specifically that can make a big difference, especially in some of the fights like Twins and Maw of Lorcage, or even just doing Runes of Mazatoon. Some of those things need to be bashed, interrupted right away. It's AoE. It's an awesome skill to use. And like, I want to back up what Woeler said about DPSing on a tank. Now, you can do it, but it's not nearly going to be as effective. So if you want to drop a standard of might on, let's say, a Magic Dragonknight tank, okay, you're going to do some flame damage over time. That's great. But in a trial, you might get, let's say, 5,000 damage a second out of this for 15 seconds, okay? Your entire group might get 500,000 more extra damage. So, big picture-wise, who cares what damage you're doing? It's about providing group for the buff, that raid DPS, that mentality of group first. This is not Veteran Maelstrom Arena. You need to have optimized group play, and that's going to reward you with ultimately easier clears.
The Dragonknight itself has a proactive way of generating ultimate faster. So the way you do this is you go to your Earthen Heart skill tree and you have a skill called Igneous Shield. This is a shield that you can apply onto yourself and onto other people. And it costs magicka. The cost is okay, even if you're a stamina tank. But what's really important about this are the passives that are in this tree. So first you have the last one, which is called Helping Hands, which says casting an ability from this skill tree will give you back 5% stamina. That means if you're running out of stamina, you can just spam this shield. But even better, you have the Mountain's Blessing, which of course provides your group with minor brutality when you use a skill, but that will be up all the time if you cast it once every 20 seconds. The way more interesting thing is, if you are in combat, you also generate 3 ultimates every 6 seconds if you cast one of these skills every 6 seconds. Meaning that you are obligated to cast a protective shield for your group to generate more ultimate. You're doing 2 things at once. A, you're gaining more ultimate, or actually 3 things. You're gaining more ultimate, you're gaining back your stamina, and you are shielding your group mate. And this is such a powerful combination of passives and skills that every tank that's playing a DK should use, because it simply is too good to pass up for just 4,000 magicka. And of course, the last skill that came to my mind, which is the skill that makes the Dragonknight tank what it is the Unrelenting Grip, which is in the Ardent Flame skill tree. And this allows you to pull enemies to you. And this is just such a game changer for big fights where mobs spread out or mages go stand at places where your DPS are not going to reach them because you're stacked up. You can just use this Unrelenting Grip, chain everything to the group, AoE it down. It's really handy for fast and solid runs through dungeons and trials.
Now, to back that up, every class has something similar to this. So, Unrelenting Grip, it's unique to the Dragonknight. However, there's a 2-piece set called Swarm Mothers, where if you're blocking, they attack you, there's a chance to pull the mob to you. Now, it's not going to work on bosses, obviously, but I use it on my Magic Nightblade, the Catalyst, and it's still pretty effective for dungeons. Now, something like a big trial or something like that, you might have to switch that 2-piece out for something more rewarding. Blessing might be unique to the Dragonknight. However, every class has something similar to this. Now, Sork has reduced ultimate cost, so it's cheaper to get ultimates. Nightblades, you can use a siphoning skill line and get ultimate as well, plus heal your group mates, so it's similar in effect. Templar can use a Dawn's Wrath ability and then generate ultimate through that way. You can also use Cleanse and other extended ritual to give yourself major mending. So Dragonknight is still the beast tank, but there's some other good options. And unless you're doing the #1 group in the world, if you think you want to play a tank, remember the core fundamentals. These weapon skill lines, focus on the passes in your class skill line that make you good. So Woeler talked about Akaviri Dragon Guard, reduce ultimate cost. Well, if I'm a Sork already, and already have a huge amount of reduced ultimate cost, why not pick that up and just be blowing warhorns every 5 seconds? You know, same thing with a Nightblade. You know, you got healing. You're doing a lot of AoE healing. Okay, well maybe not pick up a weird set like Spell Power Cure, run through dungeons, and if our healer doesn't have it, boom, I'm buffing everyone and healing and generating ultimate. So there's some weird unique combinations that can work for clearing dungeons and so forth, along with just the typical Dragonknight tank. So think outside the box, try new things, and there is no one best setup for every single thing. There really isn't. It's dependent upon the fight, your group composition, what the other tanks running, and ultimately your guys' builds.
Exactly, and if you wanna be effective at tanking, you have to keep in mind that you will be taking multiple gear setups with you. Even sometimes for the same instance, you might be swapping gear on certain bosses just to be the most effective player you can be in that role, and that is just a thing a tank has to do. As a DPS, you mostly have one setup or two setups for every class. These are the best. And the second, and with tanking, you have a lot of setups that can work for a lot of different situations, a lot of group setups, and you will have to find out what works for you and keep them with you at all times, just so that in every single fight you can play the most optimal tank possible.
Well, gang, that was part 1, and basically going over some useful skills, talking in general misconceptions about tanking. Part 2, we're going to cover gear sets and go into a much more detailed guide on basic, intermediate, and master level tanking gear. So make sure you turn back in. Part 3, we're going to cover gameplay and actually show you the difference tanking in dungeons and trials and give you some context to it. Super excited about this series. Hope you enjoy it. Tanking Talks Part 2. We're going to talk gear.